Welcome to the workshop, Which Compost is Right for You? From Julie Polanco of Julie Naturally. So before we get started, let's be clear about the difference between compost and fertilizer. I assume that you're interested in gardening, or maybe you've already started your garden and you've been to the hardware store, your grocery store, your garden center, whatever place like that, and you've seen compost bags and you've seen fertilizer bags, maybe sprays, those kinds of things. And maybe you wonder, like, well, which one should I get? What's the difference? Isn't fertilizer the same thing as compost? Well, compost is from usually some organic matter, whether that's from animal waste or from decomposing vegetables. And it benefits the soil as a whole, which of course, plants draw from the soil. So it does benefit the plants, but it makes the soil a better place for the plants to grow. Whereas fertilizer only provides specific nutrients that benefit the plant only and is usually chemically based. So those are the differences. Keep that in mind as we move forward. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit more about the pros and cons of fertilizers. So some of the pros of fertilizers is that you can give specific nutrients that will encourage growth and get your plants growing quickly. And thus, if you live in a colder climate, you may begin to see some fruits earlier. You can grow food in poor soil. Then you don't have to work as hard to amend the soil, perhaps. But fertilizers tend to emphasize only a couple of nutrients that plants need. Now, plants do produce their own food, as in making their own sugars, but they don't make their own minerals. They have to get the minerals from the soil. So if the minerals are missing from the soil, as I mentioned, you have poor soil, then the plants are not going to grow very well. But fertilizers tend to emphasize specific minerals and things that plants need. So they tend to emphasize phosphorus and sometimes calcium. And they also tend to emphasize nitrates. So they'll have a calcium nitrate or some kind of combination like that. I haven't looked lately to see exactly what the combinations are. But nitrogen is a gas, so it has to be fixed to something else in order to get that to the plants. So you see combinations like that to try to amend the soil quickly. And the other advantage with fertilizers is that you don't have to put very much in there. They usually are available maybe as a spray or some kind of mix-in with the soil that allows you to use a small amount and you get results quickly. However, the cons of that is, yes, you're only emphasizing certain minerals, which means that there could be a deficit of other minerals that the plant needs. And so there's an appearance of health, but actually the plant is less resistant to weeds and disease. And you end up having to use other chemicals to protect the plant from those things. And the fruits that result may not be as tasty or as nutritious. And the other thing is that you may see some superficial kind of growth, an excess of growth above ground with very shallow, poor roots, an excess of leaves and stems, but not very much fruit. So you don't get a good balance. It's a chemically based, very one-sided type of amendment to encouraging the growth of your vegetables. Now we're going to take a look at the pros and cons of compost. Okay, so before we start talking about the pros and cons of compost, I have to say that I am very biased. I really only use compost with my garden plants. I have seen some tremendous results with doing that, and in fact, we have tried to incorporate some sort of compost into the soil for many years, and after several years, we had the best harvest we ever had. It was tremendous. 6-foot tall tomato plants and huge broccolis. It was amazing. It was really amazing. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the pros and cons here. One of the cons is that it can take some time for the compost to really have an effect, because some of the soil always kind of washes away and goes deeper into the ground and isn't accessed by the plants. And if you live on a plot of waste soil, like most people who live in the city do, I mean, that's why your yard is full of weeds, because they grow best on waste soil. There's like no topsoil really. There's hardly any nutrition in that soil. So to amend that soil can take some time, especially if it's really packed with clay or it has a lot of sand. It's going to take time. So that's one of the big cons, is that it can take some time. Well, many of the pros are that it's cheap. You can do it yourself for no money and produce your own soil that way. But it can take a couple years to build up enough compost for an entire garden. You will have to buy some in the meantime, and that can get kind of expensive if you're buying bag after bag of that, because unlike the fertilizers where you buy a bag or a spray bottle and you just put out a little bit around the plants, the compost, you kind of have to have a whole big bag and put all of it out. You can't just use a little bit. You got to mix it in with your soil, and the soil goes deep, so you can't just spread a little bit of compost on the top. So anyway, it can be a little expensive that way at first. But the biggest benefit and pro of compost is that it benefits your soil for the long term. So after a while, you won't need to do quite so much with the compost. And you can put compost directly into the soil. You don't have to put it in a bin and wait for it to decay. You can just put the scraps right into the soil and cover it up, and it will decay like that anyway. So there are some different ways of doing things with that, but it can, in the long term, really invite the best thing possible for your plants, which is that it invites all of the microbes and the fungi and the worms and the little insects that help your plants to be sturdy and strong and disease-free. Because ultimately, that's what we want. We want healthy plants that produce lots of delicious fruits and vegetables for us. And fertilizers sometimes, as I mentioned, just encourage a lot of top growth with no substantial root growth. And so you don't get a truly healthy plant, and there ends up being a lot of problems with that. But when you work with the soil, you get more bacteria and fungi. And the reason why that's important is because the bacteria and fungi form a symbiotic relationship with the plants. So the the microbes eat the dead root cells that the plant sloughs off into the soil. They eat that, and then they're sort of attached to the plant, and so to speak, and they increase the surface area of the roots so that more water and nutrients can be absorbed without the plant expending all the energy, which is really amazing, this symbiotic relationship that it develops. And the bacteria and fungi break down those minerals that the plant cannot make on their own. They only make the sugars, but they still need the minerals, just like you and I need minerals and things we don't make ourselves. But the microbes, they break down the minerals in the soil into particles small enough that they can be absorbed into the plant's roots. So they're very important to have there, and they also fix nitrogen in the soil. They fix the gas in the soil so that the plant can also absorb that through the roots. And, of course, these microbes attract worms, which then create air pockets in the soil so that the plant's roots can bring in oxygen. Yes, plants do need oxygen too, not just the carbon dioxide like we've been told all our lives. No, they do breathe oxygen too in the soil. So it's really important to have all those air pockets in there. It's not just so that the roots have room to grow, it's so they can get the oxygen they need. So the microbes don't proliferate in poor soil. You have to have good soil to get that. So that's the big benefit, the long-term big benefit of using a compost mix instead of just fertilizer. So think carefully about that when you are growing your vegetables. You always want to put some compost in the soil, even if you choose to use some small amounts of fertilizer when you're just getting going. We're going to dig a little bit deeper now into the different kinds of compost that are available. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the types of compost. So we have worm compost, vegetable compost, animal compost. And while they're listed in a particular order, we're going to talk about animal compost first, because that might be one of the ones that you're most familiar with. We often hear about the use of manure, and some stores actually sell bags of animal manure. It's often chicken droppings or it's cow droppings. And the pros of using that is that it is a natural material. It is a part of normal soil composition. So it is something that you would find out in nature as part of the soil, and it does contribute some of the same benefits as using vegetable compost. However, it is rather stinky, and you wouldn't use a lot of that each year. And for most of us, we do have to purchase it, unless, of course, you have chickens, you raise chickens, or you raise cows or goats or something. Most people would have to buy it, and so transporting that can be a challenge. And the other con is that it can attract some types of bacteria and critters that maybe you don't want around, because it is animal waste. And as we have seen, animal waste tends to attract flies and some other insects and things that we don't necessarily want around. So if you're going to use that, you use it in smaller amounts, and you make sure you mix it into your soil really well. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the worm compost. And we have done this. We did not do it correctly, and so I have some warnings about using worm compost. The pros of using worm compost is that you can get castings from worms very quickly. So that's one of the big things that people really like about it, is that you can get some really good stuff for your garden pretty quickly and cheaply, and you don't have to have a lot of it. And it's very concentrated because it's from worms. So that's why people like to use worm compost. You can make small amounts of castings into what they call a compost tea, and spray it around your plants on the soil, and it does benefit your plants. The cons are that you have to purchase all of the supplies needed to do worms. You cannot just pull up 5 worms from your soil in your backyard and put them in a bin and start feeding them vegetable scraps. That's really not going to work, and they're not the right type of worms. There's a specific kind of worms that you use. They're red wrigglers. There's a couple other ones, but there's specific species of worms that you use. And you have to buy them in groups of 1,000 worms. And you have to put them in a container that is large enough for all of those worms. So a large garbage can be a good place for them, with a screen at the bottom so the casings drop through. And the other thing is that you have to keep your worm compost bin indoors. You can't put that in your garage in the wintertime. Keep it outside where those worms can get cold. They have to be kept in a place that's temperature controlled and reasonably warm. So there's some challenges with having a worm bin. And I'll tell you, if your container is not large enough and it's not properly sealed, those worms will escape, and they will be all over that indoor space, because that's what happened to us. And there's also some specific recommendations for how often to feed them and how much you feed them in order to maintain the health of the worms. So there are some really nice benefits, but there are some challenges. We're not going to go into all of those specifics right now with the worms, because I want to emphasize the vegetable compost, which is the cheapest, easiest way to get compost that will benefit your garden. The pros are that anyone can do it. You don't need special equipment. You don't need any special organisms. You don't need any special know-how, really. I'm going to tell you a few tips in the rest of this workshop on exactly what you put in and what you don't put in. But anybody can do it. And that's one of the greatest pros, is that it costs you next to nothing. You don't have to buy a special bin for it. You can just use some scrap wood or just have a compost pile. Nobody needs to do anything special. So the only cons with a vegetable compost is that it does take longer. It takes time for the vegetables to break down. The mechanism that you're using to break it down is the bacteria and fungi that are naturally present in all kinds of waste, and how long it takes those microorganisms to break the stuff down. So we're going to talk a little bit more about what you need to do vegetable compost. Okay, so let's get down to the nitty-gritty about our vegetable compost. So it's easy, everybody can do it, but let's get down a little bit of the mechanics. So first of all, inside your house, you're going to collect vegetable scraps. And we never put animal products in our vegetable compost. You never put your trimmings from your meat that you make, the raw meat. You never put any of the fat trimmings or none of those kinds of things. No meat products, no animal products in your compost bin. The only acceptable animal products are eggshells, and you want to make sure that you break those up properly into small pieces, because the eggshells are not going to decompose very much in the soil. Mostly what they do is they leach calcium slowly into the dirt. So in just a little bit, you're going to see that I have some finished compost that still has the eggshells showing in there. So the eggshells break down from the very slight acidity that's in the soil. But that's the only acceptable animal product that you can put in there. So if you have any questions about what to put in there, it can only come from plant material. Okay, so what I do is I have this container here, and I put biodegradable bags. You don't have to put a biodegradable bag in there. I mean, you could just, put your stuff in your little compost bin and then just carry it out to the big compost bin and just dump it in there. But I like to line it with one of these biodegradable bags. They're made of corn and they decompose with water and stuff in there just to make it easier, because it's kind of gross, So, and then the kinds of things that you're going to put, like I said, in your little inside kitchen bin are these things, okay? Fruit peels. Now, make sure you have some paper and write this down, okay? So, fruit peels, but not citrus peels. Not citrus. Vegetable peels, but don't put onions and garlic in there, okay? Vegetables, but not onions and garlic. Wilted greens. So you're going to see I have a whole bunch of wilted greens known as grass clippings that we like to use. But those can go in there. And the next thing would be like spent tea leaves. So if you use loose tea, that's perfect. If you have tea bags and they're in the thin paper kind, that works. But the strings don't really break down. Like you'll just have a bunch of loose little strings in there. Do not put those ones that come in the fancy silk bags in there. That's just not going to break down very well. Dying flowers. Don't put the stems in there. Those take a really long time to break down, and you'll end up with dirt on the bottom that's got these big stalks in there. So just trim the dead flowers off and you can put those in there. And the last thing would be coffee grounds. That also works in your nice bin. So you put it in your bin and then you walk out to your outdoor space and you just dump it there. So that's the green list. You have two types of material that you put into your bin. You have green and brown, and you want to always add both of them together. So the brown list, so you have your green list. I'll just repeat what that is, make sure you have it all down. Fruit peels, not citrus. Vegetable peels, not onions or garlic. Wilted greens of all kinds, so your lettuce and spinach and that, and also your grass clippings. Spent tea leaves, dying flowers, and coffee grounds. And then in the brown list, of course, those are things that are already kind of dead. So you have dead leaves, pine needles, crushed eggshells, like I mentioned, shredded newspapers, dead grass clippings. You have the fresh and the dead grass clippings, shredded newspaper, and other dead dried plant material. Now, if you pull weeds, do not put your dead pulled weeds in your bin. And you also want to be careful about putting anything that has seeds in it in your bin, because it will start growing in there. It's like putting the seeds in the dirt. So keep that in mind and be careful about that. So every time that you take your little bin outside and you throw in your peels, you're going to want to make sure to add some of those dead leaves or dried grass clippings or newspaper, shredded newspaper in there also. And I just want to say, your outdoor bin, I'm going to show you what my outdoor bin looks like. And I did purchase one, but you don't have to purchase one. You can use pieces of scrap wood and make yourself a wood box. That's where you're going to put your scraps. Or you can just have just a designated place in your yard where you just dump everything and it's just an open pile. If you keep to the guidelines of do not put any animal material in there, you will help to keep any critters out of your bin. So you may get insects, but you will keep scavenging animals like rats and mice out, especially rats, out of your space, because the rotting animal material attracts those kinds of animals. And you won't attract rabbits or things like that necessarily, because they eat it when it's fresh and alive, not as it's decaying. So that's what I recommend indoors, and that's how that works indoors. It's super easy. You just, instead of putting in the garbage, you put it in a little bin and you just take it outside and throw it into your big bin outdoors. Okay, so in this bin I have my brown stuff. So you can see it's like dead grass, and usually we put dead leaves in here in the fall. You could also put shredded paper, newspapers, that kind of thing. So that's, we usually have too much of that, so we keep it in a bin, and it's, a regular garbage bin. And then over here in this spring and summer, we're able to put regular grass clippings, the green stuff. So we keep that in here so that we can add that in as well. I'm not sure if you could see real well here that it is in fact fresh grass clippings, a few leaves mixed in. That too is kept in a garbage can. But then here we have a store-bought compost bin that we got. And you see that it has some slats in the side. It has a door to get the compost. See what it looks like? It's so rich and dark, and there's some eggshells mixed in there. That's the finished dirt after it's been decomposed for a while, and it's really, really nice. So that is from the bottom. So I have this door. See, I just put the door down that covers that up, but it goes up and down so you can get your compost out the bottom. But it has slats to the sides so that you can get air breathing through in and out, and also so that you can get water that goes in and out too. Because we just put some stuff in here, some grass clippings, some of the leaves and that. Get this thing going again. And I just put the top back on. It has a little door in the top. But how that usually works is what we're going to talk about next. So that's just my setup and how I have that for my. Okay, just to review how vegetable compost works. Okay, I mentioned that you should always add material from both the green and the brown groups. So I hope that you were writing that down as I was sharing that. Of course, you can always rewind a little bit and go through that again. But you always add material from both groups. That keeps the soil from getting slimy, and it also makes sure that you're benefiting from lots of different kinds of bacteria that live in the soil and need different kinds of material in order to thrive and break the soil down. You can speed up the decomposition by breaking the material into smaller pieces. So you can take those scraps and put them through your food processor. You can shred up the paper and materials with a home shredder, or some of those fruit things. Maybe you might put them in a shredder on your food processor. But the smaller the pieces are, the quicker they decompose. So maybe you get your soil faster. One thing I will mention that I haven't mentioned before, and that is that you do need to add some water to it. If you have an open-topped compost bin that is just a pile, or that is a wood framed box but it's still open on the top, then you don't need to worry about that so much. The rain will take care of that for you. But if your bin is store-bought like mine and it has a lid, then you will need to add some water periodically, because the water helps to keep things the right texture to aid in breaking everything down. And you want to mix it up periodically, whether you have an open topped bin or whether you have a bin with a lid like mine. You need to get your pitchfork in there, your shovel in there, and mix it up periodically, because the decomposition occurs in the center of your pile. It gets really hot in the center where the decomposition is taking place the most. And so that stuff is going to break down a lot faster. And so you want to be rotating what's in the center of your pile so that everything gets into the hot center at some point. So that helps also to speed up the decomposition. And like I showed you in my bin, after probably within a year, so if you start now and you start adding both of those things to your bin this year, with all of the waste products from the vegetables and your coffee that you're drinking, and the dead leaves in the fall, and the fresh green grass all summer, all of those kinds of things, if you're diligently adding all this season, next year you will have some compost to put down in your garden. It may not be a ton. It kind of depends on where you live and how much stuff you put in there and whether or not you're doing the things I suggested. But you will have some, and you'll be able to get started on enjoying the benefits of vegetable composting. Thank you for joining me today on this program about composting. I hope that you learned a lot and can get going right away with your composting project in your yard. You can touch base with me at any of these different ways that are on your screen there. I look forward to hearing from you. Have a blessed day.